The Entrepreneur's Library, Episode 15.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the EL. Today we have Alexander Taub of Pitching and Closing. Welcome, Alex, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Definitely. Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Yeah, sure. I'm Alex Taub. I'm the co-author of Pitching and Closing with my good friend Ellen De Silva, who is not here right now. She's actually in the UK. And I am also the co-founder of a company called SocialRank, which is a simple tool to help brands find out more information about the people that follow them across social networks. We started with Twitter. And for the past 2 years, I ran business development and partnerships for a startup called Dwala. It's a payments company based in Iowa. And I ran the New York office with my co-founder, and we both left to start SocialRank. 2 years before that, I ran business development for a startup called Aviary, which is a photo editing API. And I have a blog called Alex's Tech Thoughts that I write 4 posts a week, and I contribute to Forbes, the entrepreneur section, every 2 weeks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's jump right into your book, Pitching and Closing, which was just made available, or it's about to be made available, on July 25th, 2014. Alex, we're going to move quickly, but here are some of the top questions our listeners would love to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Pitching and Closing?
It's a great question. By the way, it is available for pre-orders now, and it comes out July 25th. But the inspiration was, so I've been writing for 4 years, and one day I get a LinkedIn message from an editor at McGraw-Hill asking me if I ever considered writing a book because she really liked my stuff. And I hadn't thought about it before, but I said, that's a pretty good idea. But I knew, so I met with her and I knew I couldn't pull it off on my own. I just didn't have the bandwidth. And I'm really good at writing short posts. So like Alex's Tech Thoughts is really just thoughts. It's like 2 or 3 paragraphs. So I had my good friend Ellen, who works at Twitter. She does, business intelligence there. I brought her in, I told her about the opportunity, and I basically brought her in as a partner to co-author the book with me. And without bringing her on, I don't think this would have been, I just didn't have the time. But the inspiration for writing the book was, an editor liked my stuff and just felt like there wasn't, much out there on the topic of business development and partnerships, sort of the non-technical side of early stage companies.
Okay, great. So you might have answered the second question a little bit there at the end, but what makes your book different from others regarding the same topic?
Yeah, I was sort of leading into the second question. So what makes it different? There's a lot of books about sales. There's a lot of books about, startups. There's a lot of books about, bigger corporations. There's really no great or go-to book that helps non-technical people break into the startup world. So this is really a book for people that are interested in the early stage company space, interested in startups, but don't really have the technical capabilities. They don't know how to code. They don't know how to do, design. They maybe don't know that much about product. And they want to do something in the startup world. And really available for them is community management, business development, partnerships, operations. So this is really that go-to book, or we're hoping to build the go-to book really helps people break into the non-technical side of the startup world. And jobs are scarce, and this is sort of a growing industry in all countries, the startup world, where early stage companies are, there's a lot of capital available for investing, and to get those coveted jobs, you need to know how to do it.
Okay, great. Now that we know a little bit of the history or the background behind the book, let's do my favorite part, which is take a deep dive into your creation. If you can take us through and really just show us what your book, on here you're talking to readers, that really would like to know if your book is the next great book that's going to help them create a paradigm shift.
Yeah, sure. So we actually broke the book up into 5 sections. The first section is just called business development. Basically, it goes through everything from what is business development, what types of business development are there, how do you structure your business development team, what's the difference between business development and sales, how do you network, finding a mentor, doing international business development, having a career in business development, APIs, what does that even mean, building your digital identity. The second section is an introduction to partnerships. Basically, that section talks about everything from understanding other companies. We came up with something called the 4 golden rules of partnerships, which is basically why would anyone want to work with you? And we list 4 reasons. I'll actually give it away here. Basically, it's you're either going to make them money, you're going to save them money, you're going to grow their user base, or you're going to improve their product. And basically, those are what we call the 4 golden rules of partnerships. Then we go about, we talk about 3 types of partnerships: identifying the right person at a partner company, getting feedback from partners and building it into your product, doing a deal versus doing the best deal, vapor sales. How do you sell something that doesn't exist yet? How do you sincerely sell something? And a bunch of other topics. And that's the second part, which is introduction to partnerships. The third part is the namesake of the book, which is pitching and closing, which talks about everything from pipeline and pre-pitch execution to actually making the pitch and closing the deal. Also, we talk a lot about the legality of deal making, so contracts and things like that, where we have, there's a lot of quotes from, legal from companies like Spotify and Squarespace that just give some great insight into, when you should sign a letter of intent or an NDA. Then another part of part 3 is launching deals and sort of compounding effects. So when you do product partnerships, getting companies already integrating your product and really having them sort of vouch for you publicly that this is something, or having something to point to that you could say this is something that you should take notice of. And then also, the last piece of part 3 is really just keeping the deal. Okay, you've closed it, but you got to make sure that you keep that deal. Part 4 is, I think it's broken up into 2 sections. Yeah, it's basically broken up into best practices of preparation and execution. So we talk about everything from introductions. How do you do that? What are the best practices? Reaching out and corresponding. So, what's the proper way to correspond with someone? Everything from, following up and, other best practices of that. Persistence, rejection. How do you deal with rejection? How much is, too much persistence? Being helpful and adding value. Maybe, you're not exactly sure, what you can do. Well, we walk through a few different ways you can add value. Keeping a pulse on the market, trying to understand, what is going out there in your industry, so you can go back and to your team and say, okay, we need to do this and this because these are these big shifts happening. Internal communication, working with big companies, everything from, working to the press and having a launch, partner strategy. We really go through all the best practices around all the preparation execution of being on the non-technical side of a startup. And then the last section, which is one of my favorite sections, is called war stories. And war stories are basically, each person gets their own chapter. So we talk to people like Gary Vaynerchuk, Tristan Walker, Jesse Itzler, the co-founder of Marquis Jet, Eric Friedman, who's the director of revenue of Foursquare, Aaron Pettigrew, who's the VP of business development at Gawker. We basically talk to all these people, and each one gets a chapter, and they tell their story. They just tell about why they're interesting, and why we've sort of highlighted them in the business development world. And that's really the gist of it. We're going to have, pitchingandclosing.com, which we hope to make a place that people, will go and continue to, once they finish the book, their education will continue. But that's basically the book right there.
Great. That was a fantastic summary. And there's a ton of content that you just talked about. And that's what makes number 4 probably pretty difficult. And that's if the reader could only take one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book, what would you personally want that to be?
Yeah, I think we're just the start. I don't think there's a book like this out there, so I think this is a good starting point for people. But this shouldn't be the end. This shouldn't be the only thing you read. You should start getting active on Twitter. You should start going to events and meeting people. You should start building out your digital identity. I think once you read this book, it should just get you excited about going into the startup world and how much potential there is.
Excellent. This next question I love because it gives you a chance to hopefully brag on yourself or your co-author in this case. But do you have a favorite quote or something that you wrote that you just were like, wow, this is pretty profound or powerful from your book?
So I thought about this one. I don't think there's an actual quote that I'm excited about. I think one of the sections that I really like is it's called sincere selling. It's in the introduction to partnerships. And it's something I really live by, which is, you really need to believe what you're selling to other people if you really want them to buy into it. So, if you don't believe in what you're, pitching somebody, if you don't sincerely believe it, then, you're basically like going to go and really just like, you may get a deal done, but it won't last. If you don't really believe what you're selling is going to benefit and help the other side, it's just really, I don't want to say a waste of your time, but, if you don't believe in a product you're selling, you need to get out of there and go do something else that you do believe in. So that's a section I like the most. I don't think it's a quote, but I think the whole concept of authenticity and sincereness around, pitching and closing is really important.
Okay, perfect. This is the last question that we'll run by you, but I think it's a big one for those that love to read, and that's what would be one book that you would recommend to a reader that created a paradigm shift for you?
Yeah, I would say that I read when I was getting out of high school. I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad. And at the time, I didn't know. It's not a startup book. It's a business book. It's just more. I guess it's a business book, but the writer writes nicely, and he sort of, goes through, the whole concept of being successful in the business world. And that book had a big impact on me. I read it, and I really, after I read it, I wanted to go into the business world. So I would say, yeah, Rich Dad Poor Dad.
Okay, great. Alex, you've shared a couple different ways, but I still want to ask you before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to get more information on you and your book, Pitching and Closing? Yeah,
so pitchingandclosing.com, and then from there you can pre-order the book. I'm on Twitter. I'm at AJT. That's my initials, Alexander Joseph Taub. Ellen is also on Twitter. She's Ellen J. De Silva, which is ELLEN J De Silva, DASILVA, De Silva. And yeah, you can email us. I mean, I think it's author. I want to say it's like authors at Pitching and Closing or Alex at pitchingandclosing.com. I think there's ways to get in touch with us from it. I believe it's on it's authors at pitchingandclosing.com. But that's also on the pitchingandclosing.com. So yeah, that's the best way to get in touch with us. And we're also at PNC on Twitter. So, and this is just the beginning. The book's the first step, but we hope to do a lot of interesting things around the book once it's released.
Excellent. Very good. Well, thank you for coming on today and sharing your book with us.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you would like to get your hands on Pitching and Closing or any of the other resources mentioned by Alex, just look at the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.